Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to LAU, New York Academic Center. My name is Lina Beydoun, and I'm the director here of the Academic Center. I'd like to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Rand Ghayad. He specializes in applied economic theory, labor issues, and public policy. He is currently an associate expert at the Brado Group and a research advisor at MIT, the Sloan School of Management. He was previously a distinguished visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank in Boston and was an economic consultant for prominent organizations such as the Brookings Institution, International Labor Organization, and the United Nations Development Program. Dr. Ghayad's rigorous analysis uncovered groundbreaking facts about why, in spite of an increase in job vacancies, unemployment rates did not go back to their normal level since the end of the Great Recession here in the United States. Surprisingly, age, education, occupation, skills, and unemployment benefits were not the main contributors to high unemployment rates. The single most important factor determining whether one lands a job or not in the United States is the length of time since they were unemployed. The explanation fundamentally lies in structural factors and not individual factors, especially discrimination against those who have been unemployed for more than 6 months. A testament to Dr. Ghayad's novel theory is his broad recognition in both public and private sectors and among high-level American politicians and policymakers. His work is cited in over 400 articles, books, and congressional testimonies, as well as by President Barack Obama himself, Federal Reserve Chairman Janet Yellen, and Nobel laureate Paul Krugman. Earlier this year, he met with President Barack Obama and senior advisors at the White House to discuss the challenges of long-term unemployment and plan new initiatives for developing a competitive workforce. As a result, President Obama signed an executive order to ban discrimination against unemployed job seekers who have been out of work for a long time. Several states, such as New York and New Jersey, followed suit. Dr. Ghayad's success story began in Lebanon, where he was born and raised and mentored by LAU faculty in the business school. He arrived in Boston in 2007 on a scholarship from Boston University. He was soon named Student of the Year and received an Excellence in Graduate Studies award. He then received his PhD in Applied Economics from Northwestern University. LAU recognized Rand Ghayad's immense contributions to tackling one of the most complex issues in America by granting him the Alumni Achievement Award this year. Rand Ghayad is dedicated to implementing policies that would effectively reduce unemployment in the US, Europe, and the Middle East. He continues to raise awareness of the stigma associated with the long-term unemployed. He advocates making jobs search tools accessible for free to job seekers. As a young pioneer, he tirelessly addresses in unprecedented ways one of the fundamental human rights affecting the livelihood of millions of people, the right to work. I am certain that these accomplishments are a few of many to come. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rand Ghayad.
Thank you, Lina. This is probably longer than my talk. I'd like to thank you all for showing up here tonight. Thanks to Lina and Ed and all the LAU community people. Everybody is here tonight. I promised Lina to make this I'm trying to stay away from becoming too technical in my talk, because mainly this presentation was to back up a paper that I wrote for the Federal Reserve Bank. So we'll see how it goes, but if you think I'm too technical, feel free to stop me, ask me questions, that's fine. As you probably can tell from this title, I'll be discussing, and as Lena mentioned, one of the most fearful moments that anybody or any individual in this room and everywhere can ever encounter in his life, which is the state of being unemployed. This is something that has been taking a lot of attention lately by policymakers and by academics all over the place on both sides of the Atlantic. In fact, I checked in my hotel room this afternoon and I turned on CNN News. There was a major story. Excuse me. So there was a major story on CNN News about the recession in Spain. So the story was that the recession in Spain is now over. And the economists normally can tell if a recession is over by looking at the growth rate. So growth rate in Spain was positive 0.01%, and that was enough for them to celebrate the end of the recession. In fact, the story was so exciting that some of the Lebanese media outlets, if you look now at some of the outlets, they've actually picked up on this story. Now, the sad part is they mentioned along the lines that unemployment in Spain is still stuck at 27%. But that appeared to be just a relatively minor blemish on this exciting story that the recession is over. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the European experience, but like Spain, many other European countries, a lot of countries also in Latin America and also in the Far East have been struggling with very high unemployment rate lately. This goes back to 2007. Now, high unemployment rate for long periods of time isn't something new for European countries. This is actually the norm. But I mean, every time there's a recession and unemployment goes up, it tends to stay high for a very long period of time. We've seen this in most of the European countries. One exception, though, at least in the past, has been the United States. In fact, the United States is the only exception. In the 12 recessions that we've had in the history of the United States, out of the 11 recessions prior to the most recent one, every time unemployment went up, it took at most 1 year for it to go back to its normal level. Only in this recent recession, unemployment went up and it continued to be persistently high, despite the fact that we've heard that employers were posting a lot of new vacancies over time. So this is the first time we're encountering this problem, and this is a problem that will affect every one of us here, and we'll talk about this as we move on throughout the talk. But before actually I dig into the juicy part, let's just go over a brief introduction of this crisis, what actually led us to what we are, where we are now, right now. So as we all know, there's a financial crisis that hit the economy in 2007. This actually led to one of the worst economic recessions in the history of the United States. It's actually the second worst after the Great Depression that we had in the 1940s. So we've lost a lot of jobs, around 9 million jobs, and the economy shrank by hundreds of billions of dollars. We've also seen housing prices going up, which is basically was the main reason for this crash. So at some point prior to 2007, everyone who applied for a mortgage was eligible to get a mortgage. 18 years old person would go to a bank and would get a mortgage. So everybody was buying houses, and then this started pushing housing prices up until the crash hit our economy. People lost their jobs. They couldn't afford to pay their mortgages anymore, so they defaulted. And all these mortgages were packed together in mortgage-backed securities and sold on Wall Street. So this triggered the financial crisis in the stock market, which actually led to this recession. So what we have done so far, we've heard probably of the stimulus package that President Obama put together, $700 billion tailored to stimulate this economy back. Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, have actually done a lot to stimulate the economy, starting by what we call quantitative easing 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we've seen some good signs, and you don't have to worry about these graphs. I'll just try to explain them in an easy way. So we've seen business lending growing. This is a very good sign. We've seen household wealth also rebounding and going up. So again, this is a sign the economy is improving. The federal budget has actually went back down to its normal level after a huge spike prior to the recession. And most importantly, which is going to be the topic of tonight, is that the unemployment rate, as you can see in the upper right corner, has been actually declining over time. So if you look at the news now, you would find out that unemployment is around 5.9%, down from 10.5. So that's probably good news for many of us and for most of the reporters who actually report on these statistics. But the first thing that we learn in economics, or the first thing that we teach our students, is there are two reasons why unemployment may be going down. One of them is obviously people finding jobs, and the other is people getting discouraged and leaving the labor force. So in the way we calculate the unemployment rate, we ask people the question, are you actively looking for a job? Are you sending resumes? If the answer is no, we don't include you as part of this sample. So while this is something that sounds to many as a good sign, if we actually control or bring back all these people who got discouraged and left and stopped looking for a job, we'll find what we see in red, actually. So the blue line is the actual unemployment rate, the one that you see on the news, but the red line is just the real unemployment rate. So you can probably tell in 2014, or just right now, unemployment would continue to be persistently high, up at 10.5%, despite the fact that employers were posting around 280,000 jobs every single month. So obviously there's a problem there. There's something going on that we need to fix. And we've done a lot of things, but over the past 6 years, nothing have actually helped those people who are unemployed. And again, I mean, you probably hear stories about people committing suicide, people using their retirement accounts, people having some social problems. So unemployment is a big issue. We don't pay a lot of attention to it back in Lebanon and in the Middle Eastern countries, but we'll talk later why we should actually care and why, what's going on with the group of the unemployed people in the United States. But before we do this, I want to make two very important points, actually. The first is, or before I get to my point, I just want to point out that what's really alarming about this graph is that many of those people who don't have a job in the United States have been out of work for more than 6 months. So this is what we call in the US the long-term unemployed. So although we have a lot of unemployed people, most of these have actually lost their jobs for a long period. And spending long period may actually make you lose your skills. If, for example, if you sit home for 2 years, 3 years, you may actually lose some of your skills. So that's another thing that is worrisome. And this is why a lot of politicians lately have been targeting most of their policies to helping those who are long-term unemployed. On the other hand, you probably heard a lot of Republican senators lately arguing that the problem is that these long-term unemployed are lazy. This is something that we've heard from time to time. The reason that people can't find jobs isn't that the economy is bad. It's because they're just lazy. They're collecting unemployment paychecks from the government. So let's just cut these unemployment paychecks. So there are opposing views here in the United States. We're not going to discuss who's right, who's wrong, but I'll show you my results and we'll see at the end what makes sense. But just to let you know about the composition of those who are long-term unemployed. In the United States, we have around 3.2 million people who've been out of work for more than 6 months. Out of these, we have 2 million who've been out of work for more than 52 weeks. These people have PhDs, some of them have bachelors, some of them don't have graduate degrees, or they just have a high school degree. They are diversified in terms of age groups, occupation, industry. So it's not like long-term unemployment is a problem that is hitting one group or another. It's all over the place. And in fact, if you compare those who are long-term unemployed to the short-term unemployed ones, the short-term are just been out of work for less than 6 months, you'll find that the long-term unemployed are actually better educated. They're slightly better educated and skilled. So it's not likely to be true that the reason they can't find a job is that they don't have the skills. It seems that they are better educated compared to the short-term ones. So let's get to the two most important points that I want to make today. The first point that I want to leave you with, hopefully, is that these long-term unemployed are not structurally unemployed. When I say structurally unemployed, it means there's something wrong with them. They even don't have the skills to get the job. They even are not willing to move to where the jobs are. So we've heard a lot of stories like, there's a lot of jobs in New York, but the long-term unemployed are in Michigan. They're not willing to move to New York, so it's their problem. So this is actually not true. We've seen a lot of studies discrediting this hypothesis. And in fact, if we knew this back in 2008, we could have saved the United States hundreds of billions of dollars. A big portion of the Obama stimulus package was targeted at training these long-term unemployed. So anytime in every recession that we've had in the past, the problem was that there's some sort of a mismatch in the skills. So to help these people get back on track and get back to jobs, we always used the same policy, which is let's train them, let's put them in schools, let's give them some computer skills. So we spent billions of dollars in this recession trying to train these long-term unemployed. This is something that the White House started, and at some point, nothing happened. We still have the same number, if not more. So if we knew this, things could have been different. So there's probably something else going on other than the structural hypothesis. The other thing, which I've already mentioned, is unemployment benefits has nothing to do with being unemployed. So in the United States, if you lose your job and you obviously have a US citizenship, you're entitled to go and collect some sort of unemployment benefits, a paycheck, which is a portion of your prepaid check. So if I'm making $500 per week in the Boston area, if I lose my job, I'm entitled to collect up to 50% of my previous paycheck. Many people were arguing that the reason people aren't finding jobs, again, is that they're just depending on these paychecks. So I'm going to explain why this is not true and unemployment benefits has nothing to do. In fact, in December 2013, we voted, the United States Congress voted on cutting these unemployment benefits because they thought that this is what's keeping the labor market from improving. So now you're not entitled anymore if you lose your jobs. We don't have unemployment benefits anymore in this recession. So this is something unfortunate for the long-term unemployed, obviously. So we'll talk about what is going on and why we really need to worry as individuals living in this country. Let me just point one thing, and this is the bottom line message that I'd like to leave you with. This is that we are currently facing or experiencing a one-time unique transformation of the labor market. The United States is going through a phase right now that we've never encountered in the past. We've seen some of this in Europe, but this is the first time that we see this kind of labor market. And it's important because it affects most of us, most of the economy in general, most of our relatives, and it has a lot of consequences on other things like social problems and other economic, financial problems. So it's a problem that is worth stressing and looking at. This is why President Obama actually called this problem a national crisis, and it should be at the top agenda of the United States. So why do we care and why we really need to worry about this? Why do I need to make this lecture? We'll talk about it as we move on in the next few slides. But I don't want to scare you with some of the graphs, but there's one important graph that every economist looks at if you want to find out what's going on in the labor market. So if you really want to look at how the labor market is doing in terms of are people finding jobs, are they not finding jobs, is it taking a lot of time to find a job? There's a graph that we call the Beveridge curve. And the Beveridge curve, before looking at this, the Beveridge curve is just an inverse relationship between two things. You see on the vertical axis, job vacancy rate. So this is just the amount of jobs or the rate of job openings. On the horizontal axis, you see the unemployment rate. So normally, if firms post more jobs, you would expect the unemployment rate to go down. So this relationship between the two is always inverse. It's an inverse relationship that should give us something like this black curve. So if the labor market is working correctly, as we post more positions, we should expect the unemployment rate to react in an inversely proportional way. What we've seen in this recession, or actually after the recession, is something we've never seen before in the United States. Something happened to the Beveridge curve. So sometime in August 2009, firms started posting vacancies, but unemployment actually increased, and then it kept increasing and never went down. And this was the main reason why all these economists, including some of the Obama administration economists, thought initially that this is a structural problem, so let's design this stimulus package. And that's because this is how we always used to think. The tools that we've had in the past are the first thing that we went for when we wanted to solve our problem now in the present. Unfortunately, this is a problem that we can't solve with the same policy tools that we've had in the past. And the first thing that I found when I was actually doing my PhD is I wanted to look at this curve in a different way, so I took it and I decomposed it into two things. I looked at only the short-term unemployed and also only at the long-term unemployed. So in other words, rather than looking at all those people who are unemployed, I looked at two groups. If you can tell what's going on with the short-term unemployed over there, there's really no weird pattern. The short-term unemployed are just behaving in the same exact way that we would expect them to behave. So when we posted vacancies, everybody who is short-term unemployed was benefiting from these vacancies. But the long-term unemployed were behaving in the same weird way. And again, don't worry about the graphs. The whole message here is the short-term unemployed, those out of work for less than 6 months, didn't really have any problem during the recession or after the recession. The problem was only among the long-term unemployed. The reason we have an unemployment problem is coming from those guys. So why is that? One time I was sitting there looking at these job search websites and how they've actually changed the way we deal with things. So now with these technologies, it's very easy for any job seeker to send like probably 100 resumes per day. You can just go online and just send an email with your resume and cover letter, go on a career builder or Monster, and just one click would basically give you the option to apply for a job. So with these technologies, statistics now tell us that every job that a company opens receives on average around 1,200 resumes from various people. People just become so desperate that they just want to look for any job and just send, and some people just want to practice their interview skills. I'll be an engineer and I'll apply as just a nurse probably, just to practice my interview skills. So on average, every job opening gets around 1,200 resumes. So there's really no way, it's basically unreasonable for an HR person to sit down and go through every single resume. It doesn't make any sense, it's a waste of time. So in return, what firms are doing, they're actually investing in what we call automated screening tools. So it's very cheap now to buy one of these programs, and you set it such that it would screen only the resumes that fits the criteria that you're looking for. So if I don't want to hire a Lebanese, I will make sure that the system could tell if this is a Lebanese and it would kick his resume out. So it sounds like, based on what I found, that firms are basing their hiring decision on the length of unemployment. And it appears to me that 6 months is actually a critical point. Whether you come from a top school, whether you have the exact experience, if your resume shows that you've been out of work for 6 months or more, there's no way you can get an interview. It becomes nearly impossible. And I'll tell you how I found that. I actually first, the idea came by just actually looking at some of these online job search websites. I was just looking online and I found, I've highlighted a couple of them. Many of these ads, they explicitly state that if you are long-term unemployed, don't bother and apply. We're just looking to hire people who are currently employed or recently unemployed. This is totally legal. It used to be totally legal. So it's illegal to discriminate based on gender, based on age, based on race, but it was okay for an employer to ask that I only want to consider the unemployed. the employed. Normally, an employer would rather hire somebody with a job because he would think that he's probably more efficient, he's probably more up to date, and so on. So this appeared to me, and I wanted to see if this is actually something happening at the national level. So I created a program. We got a funding from the Federal Reserve Bank, and we created a program that would generate thousands of resumes. I've actually created 3,500 fake resumes, or resumes for fake people, and I varied how long you've been out of work. And what I did is I took these resumes and I sent them to firms. So think about it as I get 5 resumes, people are exactly the same, pretty much same age, same education, same industry, same school. The only difference is Ed has been out of work for 7 months, Lena has been out of work for 2 months, and I send these resumes to real job openings, and then I record who gets an invite for an interview. So I send these resumes, and it turns out that all these fake applicants with a spell above 6 months would get no invite. So nobody really calls them back. Then I was like, okay, let me try to make these long-term unemployed people more attractive. And let me try to make the short-term ones, the ones who are getting the interview request, less appealing to employers. So I made the long-term unemployed much better. I gave them the exact experience that employers were looking for. If an employer is looking for someone with X number of years, I would give him the X number of years in the exact field. So I made the long-term unemployed more appealing, and the short-term unemployed, I assigned them with irrelevant experience. And what did I find? Fortunately, turns out that even if you come from a top school, even if you come with the exact same experience, your experience or you only matter for an employer as long as you are a short-term unemployed. Once you fall in this trap, and this is where I come with this title, the Jobless Trap, once you fall in this 6 months of unemployment, it becomes nearly impossible for you to get a job. Why? Because it's not a human being looking at your resume. It's the system that is only screening the length of unemployment and kicking out all these resumes who are long-term unemployed. A Harvard guy from, obviously, a guy from a top school, without mentioning the names, with the exact experience, like working for a bank, wouldn't get an interview from Bank of America, but Bank of America would go after a guy with a low-ranked school who worked at CVS. That's how weird and bad the labor market is. So again, if there's a financial analyst position at Bank A or Bank of America, as a first step in their screening process, we're actually going after the short-term unemployed that have no experience at all, rather than looking after the Harvard people and the top school people who have the same exact experience, worked at Citibank and other banks. So this was published, and a couple of other people done actually similar work, and actually a couple of states have started implementing laws to ban discrimination. New York City was the first one. So now in New York City, if you were able to show that you've been discriminated or an employer have actually used your unemployment status when making a hiring decision, you can sue and you can make a lot of money, and then you don't need to find a job anymore. So we'll talk about these, but now it's illegal in most of the states. Started in New York and moved all over the place. Unfortunately, we don't have it in Boston, but it's pretty much all over the place. It's illegal. And we'll talk about some of the things that the Obama administration did. This is just a graph showing my results. Basically, the blue points up there are the ones for people with the exact experience. The red points are the ones with the irrelevant experience. As you can see, after the 6 months, those guys, the blue ones, are worse off than these guys. Just telling us that it's just the unemployment spell that we really care about. So, policy implications, what does this mean? Why do we care? Why is this happening in general? This is just because employers in the past have tried the long-term unemployed. So as an employer, I probably hired the long-term unemployed in the past when the economy was much better, and it turns out to be a bad worker. So when things got worse, they wanted to use the same beliefs. So now they still think, although now the problem is not specific to the individual, it's a macro problem, they're still using their same old beliefs. If you are a long-term unemployed, then you're probably lazy, you're probably unskilled, you probably don't want a job. There's no reason why you don't have a job, so why would I bring you for an interview? This is in the mentality of an employer. And when I reached out actually to some of the recruiters and I've asked them this question, they all were okay with it. They said, if we're looking at two people, why bring in a long-term unemployed if I can find somebody who has a job and interested? So unfortunately, this is something that is affecting the population because it's not their problem nowadays. The problem is specific to the economy. It's the recession, it's the bad economy that's actually bringing this. So what have we done? Obama administration in January signed a pledge. He actually met with 300 big firms, CEOs of 300 big firms, and he asked them to take a shot at hiring the long-term unemployed. All these 300 firms, including the major ones, have actually gave a chance and tried the long-term unemployed. So I bring in a long-term unemployed, I give him a chance. Come in as an intern, come do an internship, and if I like you, I'll keep you. So they all gave a chance to the long-term unemployed, and it worked. State-level anti-discrimination bans, as we mentioned, it started in New York and all over the place. And just recently, a few weeks ago, the White House and the Department of Labor started giving out huge grants, like millions of dollars, to small organizations that are trying to connect the long-term unemployed to jobs. So many of these long-term unemployed became depressed. They stopped looking for a job. They gave up. They lost their houses. So there are many organizations now that are trying to bring them back, connect them with recruiters, connect them with employers. So they're being compensated for that. So enough for the United States. Obviously, we have the same or probably a more worse problem in Lebanon. And I wanted just to include a couple of things about Lebanon. And the first question that I asked myself, can these practices work in Lebanon, which is a labor market that also have a very high long-term unemployment rate? And obviously the answer, we can't apply these in Lebanon. They're not going to work in Lebanon. And we'll talk about the reasons. But just to give you a brief overview of what's going on in Lebanon right now, prior to the Syrian crisis, we've had high unemployment, as usual, but the problem was a skill mismatch. So people were either overqualified or underqualified for the jobs. Now, after the Syrian crisis, we've had an increase in the labor force by 50%. So all these people now are competing, all these foreigners are now competing, obviously, for the same jobs that we had. So it's a tough labor market with no enough jobs, with no investments. It's very hard to figure out a solution. So we'll talk about what can be done to accommodate foreigners and domestic workers in Lebanon. But before that, just want to point out that Lebanon is only one of 5 countries, probably less than 5 countries, that have a very weird economic problem nowadays. It's called stagflation. So normally, or actually let me go to the statistics, after the Syrian crisis started, real GDP has been going down by 3% every month. At the same time, so the economy was declining. At the same time, prices were going up. Normally when GDP or the economy is doing bad, you would expect prices to go down. So when you see GDP going down and prices are going up, this is a very special economic disaster that we economists call stagflation. And we have it in Lebanon, and it's been there for years. And this is one of the reasons why countries like Bolivia, Germany, back in the 80s, have entered either in a hyperinflation or in a depression. So this is like a hidden bomb that is going to explode at some point. It's going to lead to a huge depression, unfortunately, and nobody cares. So we'll talk about why we're not doing anything and what can be done in Lebanon. But just wanted to point out to this problem. So just according to just a very recent study by the World Bank, as a result of the Syrian crisis, around 250,000 Lebanese actually were pushed into the poverty line, in addition to the 1 million who were already there. That's like making $2 per day or living on $2 per day. Syrian crisis have led to doubling the unemployment rate. It took me probably more time to find the unemployment rate statistic for Lebanon than the whole presentation. There's no statistics, so it's very hard. but I'm relying on this study. It says 20%, but I think it's way more. So basically, the World Bank are saying that it's a 20% unemployment rate now. This is very bad. We can't collect taxes. Obviously, the budget is going to suffer. So what can we do in Lebanon? I've put together a couple of solutions. Some of them are short-term, some of them are long-term. It's okay if somebody can encourage people to apply the short-term ones. The short-term ones have been applied in different countries like Germany, Greece, Portugal. They worked perfectly. And I think, based on my research, that they would work perfectly in Lebanon. Now, the first one is just giving companies subsidies. There is no way we can prevent companies from not hiring a refugee at a lower wage or a foreign worker at a lower wage. The problem now is that foreign workers who are coming to the Lebanese labor market are competing with the Lebanese workers, and foreigners are accepting a job at a much lower wage. So to save the Lebanese population or workforce, one thing we could do is pay these companies the difference. And we'll talk about where this money will come from. But one way is let the company pay whatever they want to pay. And let's pay them the difference if they accept to hire a Lebanese domestic worker. Other way is many Lebanese workers are not willing to take some jobs because they don't pay much. There are jobs that they're not willing to take, so they complain that it's the market is bad. So to encourage these people to jump back and work and make some money, let's pay the difference to these people. We've done this at some point in the United States, actually, during this recession. We've paid some employees the difference, like an extra wage, just to encourage them to take some low-wage jobs. And it worked. Now, long-term solutions, obviously, they will never be adopted in Lebanon, but something along the line like training programs could help later in the future, would help decrease this mismatch problem. But for now, these two short-term solutions are essential to improve the labor market. The question, of course, is we have a huge debt. Where are we going to get this money from? How are we going to afford to pay this money? We have like $65 billion national debt at this point. So where are we going to get this money to pay companies and pay workers and try to improve the labor market? And the second thing I'm going to show you when you tell me this is we have 20% unemployment rate. I think that's an underestimation of the real unemployment rate, but we have a huge amount of unemployment rate. And in economics and finance all over the place, there's always a trade-off. If you want to fix unemployment, you have to fix it at some cost. You have to accept that if we spend money, we're going to see some inflation. We're going to see the national debt going up. So which one is more important? Here's the question. And the first thing we will talk about is whether we should worry about the debt, which is now the main political thing. We can't spend money because we have a lot of debt. So do we really care about the debt? And the answer is no. We only care about an increase in the debt if our economy is at full employment. That means if we're doing our best as a country. If we're doing our best, we're producing our potential, everybody is employed, then if the government borrows money, this is going to put pressure on interest rates, and this is going to have a counter-cyclical effect. But obviously we're not there. We're in a recession. So in a recession, borrowing extra money, increasing the debt above the 65 is totally fine, at least for the short term. You can borrow money. This is not going to put any pressure on interest rates or on prices. And you can actually finance all these propositions that we've put forward. So I'm not worried about the debt. We should encourage the government to actually borrow. Now, the second question, who's going to give us this money? Where are we going to borrow from? Foreigners, IMF, World Bank, they got sick probably of lending us because we're never using this money in productive projects. And it's always the agreement. We'll give you the money if you invested in a project that will have positive net benefits. So we don't have these projects anymore. But there is a lot of, before I show you the slide, there is a lot of money that is sitting at the central bank in Lebanon, idle, doing nothing. There's a lot of foreign reserves sitting there. There's a lot of money in the banks. So why not borrow from the central bank? What is the central bank doing with this money? In fact, I've been in the United States for 7 years. Probably every year I hear a story about an award being given to the governor of the central bank, with all respect. But you've been getting awards for maintaining a stable value of the lira. And I'm asking you this question: why do we care about keeping the value of the lira stable if we have 20% unemployment, if we have 8% inflation, if we have $65 billion debt? Who cares about the stable lira if the economy is dead, if there are no jobs, nobody can find a job? This has been the main goal of the central bank in Lebanon. This is the only country, unfortunately, where monetary policy, and I say it here, is not driving the economy. So it's the economy that is driving monetary policy. We'll kill the economy. We don't care about creating jobs. We'll do anything so that we can keep the value of the lira stable, and we get an award at the end of the year for keeping the value of the lira stable. The way it should work, the reason we have monetary policy is we should use this monetary policy to fix the economy, not the other way around. So if the economy is bad, this is when the central bank should print money. This is when the central bank should pump a lot of funds into the market. And then people are going to say, what about inflation? We put a lot of money into the hands of people. This is going to drive prices up. Should we worry about inflation? Obviously, I mean, if we have to worry about inflation, we should worry about it in the United States. The central bank have been printing money since 2009. Quantitative easing, this is a program at the Federal Reserve Bank. We've done 4 different sets of quantitative easing. We've printed billions of dollars. We've put it in the market. Inflation has actually decreased. Prices have went down instead of going up. Why is that? Because nowadays we have policies, we have tools at the Federal Reserve Banks that can actually control inflation. Back when hyperinflation happened in Bolivia and Germany and other countries, we didn't have these tools. But now nobody worries about inflation. We have the tools to counter inflation. So if the US is not worrying, Lebanon shouldn't worry about inflation. They should spend money. So inflation isn't a problem. Monetary policy, and I say this here, nowadays is way different than monetary policy in the past. Final slide, and this is just to tell you that I'm not worried about the lira at all. The only thing that would affect the lira is if we all lose confidence in this banking system and we withdraw our money. Printing money, borrowing more money is never going to affect the value of the lira in the United States. So I'm least worried about the lira. I'm less worried about inflation. We're obviously going to see inflation as we print more money. If the Fed decides to put more money, we're going to see inflation, but that's fine. The thing that worries me most is unemployment. Let's fix unemployment at some cost and then worry later about inflation. The debt is something in the middle. Obviously, at some point, we need to control this increasing debt, but we can't just sit now and say we can't borrow, we can't do anything, we have a lot of debt. We need to take some risks. We need to increase our spending, and in the future, solving the debt would be another issue. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Thank you again very much, Rand, for this very, very informative talk and the comparative analysis with Lebanon's economy and unemployment rates. I'm going to open the floor for questions for Rand. Who would like to ask?
Thanks. Well, thank you, Rand. I've really heard so many good things about you, and now I know why. First question about if let's say you file a complaint that you've been discriminated against when you apply for a job, how can you prove that?
It's a very good question. Yeah.
And then the second question, assuming that we manage to resolve the issue of unemployment in Lebanon for the Lebanese labor force, now in Lebanon we have a huge problem with refugees. That's also something I assume we should think about. So what would be the solution for that issue also, not just for the Lebanese labor force, but also for the Syrian one? Thank you.
So to answer your first question, this is something that we're currently still struggling with as academics, policymakers in the United States. It's very hard to document that an employer have actually discriminated against you. But the same way we've seen lawsuits in the past showing age discrimination and race discrimination, the same way applies now to unemployment discrimination. For example, most of these cases are mainly class action lawsuits. So if an individual have evidence internally that the program, for example, is screening based off unemployment status and have shared this evidence with outsiders anyway, this is by itself a whole lawsuit case. This is how these previous demographic discrimination cases have been dealt with. But again, this is a very good question and makes the solution a bit challenging because it's very hard. I've seen some people now raising this issue and starting some class action lawsuits, but the Supreme Court is just rejecting it and not accepting it as a class action because the evidence isn't critical. So it's hard to collect the evidence, but hopefully this would just scare firms from using these tools. Hopefully firms would at least understand that there's nothing wrong with the long-term unemployed. Maybe we can hire him at a lower wage, maybe we can try him, maybe he could be better. So this law is kind of more as a just raising the flag, trying to point out that let's try these guys. Your second question, obviously we have a big problem with refugees, but again, this is a lot of political issue more than an economic issue. So probably Lebanon is the only country where politics and economics cannot be separated. It's impossible. So this is a little big political question, I guess. But at least we can do something for the Lebanese. If we can encourage firm to hire the Lebanese and pay them the difference, then that's fine. And that by itself will make things clear out over time. So if we can get the Lebanese back to work, save this domestic labor force, I think eventually foreigners will find the new businesses, they will create their own small businesses. And one program cannot by itself work. We need to do what the central bank is supposed to be doing. So if we spend money, we probably can create more jobs for everybody if we do the same things that other countries have done. But again, this is a very political issue that it's hard to solve completely, but at least we can start by step one, try to figure out how to avoid having a Lebanese crisis in the labor market. Sure.
Hi, great talk, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
The US is different from Lebanon.
Of course.
The US can print money, and the US and the dollar is a reserve currency, so it doesn't change anything. The Lebanese lira is in a different boat. So if we have hyperinflation, let's say the central bank starts printing liras like they do here,
yeah.
It's going to devalue the lira dramatically, right? And Lebanon is not Lebanon doesn't export that much, or does it import? It exports less goods, it's more services, and so maybe you can discuss that.
That's a good question too. So again, one of my suggestions is just keep the lira afloat. It's okay to devalue the value of the lira. That's totally fine. And printing money at the central bank shouldn't be a problem just because we have a lot of foreign reserves sitting at the central bank. So at any point in time, the central bank can buy back the lira and sell foreign exchange to control the value if things get really worse. If we didn't have these foreign reserves sitting at the bank, if we didn't have these foreign currencies and dollars sitting at the bank, then your suggestion is definitely right. It's going to end up in a hyperinflation. There's nothing that would help us control the devaluation of the lira. But given how much reserves are sitting at the bank, we're not using them for anything. This is by itself a tool to fix things when we see signs of a dollar or a lira crisis. Does that answer your question?
Yes, very much.
Thanks.
Hi, thanks for the presentation again. To touch on the same point previously made, we have a pegged currency. So how does a pegged currency is able to print that much money to sustain the unemployment rate and to be able to provide as well the same, to adapt to the demand, to the salary demand of the Lebanese public, to not have more foreigners work in our country, like you just said before?
Sure. So I probably didn't make this clear in my presentation because I didn't want to spend a lot of time talking about the lira. We do have a pegged currency, but my suggestion is let the lira float. So depeg the currency.
Oh, so you're saying depeg the currency?
Yeah, so now the currency is pegged, so it's fixed. The dollar is probably 1,500 Lebanese lira. So we need to depeg it, so let it float. It's okay for the dollar, the lira value to change relative to the dollar. This is the only way, I mean, we can shock this economy. We need to create some shock in this economy so that people would start investing, people would start making businesses and creating jobs. So we need to depeg the currency, let it float over a range. We had I think Rais al-Hos, he's an old prime minister. He always actually wanted to do this, and they never listened to him. Just let the lira float over some range, and once it comes above this range, like between 1,000 and 2,000, let the dollar be going between 1,000 and 2,000 lira. Once it shoots over this range, we can again do what I proposed initially, just bringing back the foreign currency.
Isn't that what China is doing with
Most of the countries now are pegging their currency relative to a basket of currencies. So instead of just fixing our lira relative to the dollar, some of them are fixing their currencies relative to a basket of different currencies. And it's not a good idea actually at this point to peg relative to the dollar. The dollar by itself is no longer the strongest currency. There's been a lot of talks that at some point when this quantitative easing is gonna end, there's a lot of money that is floating, so the Federal Reserve needs to find a way to bring this money out. This is gonna affect the dollar value a lot. So since we're pegged at the dollar, since our Lebanese currency is based on the value of the dollar, this is gonna create a disaster. So to start as a starting point, we can just peg the lira relative to a basket of different currencies, probably euro and the dollar and some other currencies, and let it float. It's okay for the value to be going back and forth.
But you see, what I don't understand is the lira was pegged after the Lebanese civil war to control it, right? So it was pegged in a way that for it not to devalue to a certain point where it wouldn't make sense anymore
True.
to have a lira anyway. So how do you suggest that you depeg the lira and put it on the floating rate, but at the same time not try to sustain the effect of the lira not devaluating to
Right.
a very
Again,
bad level and basically not make sense anymore, like we saw in Argentina,
Right.
and like we saw in like other countries where they're, like we saw in Turkey, for example.
Right, exactly. I mean, again, my answer to you, and you're totally right, my answer is there is a trade-off. You have to depeg, there's going to be some costs. But at this point, at this current stage, the way the Lebanese economy is structured, depegging the currency wouldn't kill the economy as much as keeping it pegged would do. So there are some costs. The value of the lira will change, but we can control it with some range. And once it jumps above the range, we'll bring in the foreign reserves. But yeah, I mean, some countries actually suffer from inflation or hyperinflation, and this is when they decided, let's peg our currency. There's no strong currency now around the world that we can actually trust and peg against. Question.
Thank you for the talk. I think what you're saying is it's going to get worse before it gets better if we depeg, and then that's part of the process. You talked about politics and economics being closely tied. You know, in the region, there's a big conflict happening, and we can talk about how the Western countries and the U.S. are dealing with some of the economic issues. Can you discuss how the current crisis in the Middle East essentially cannot allow investors to have confidence, irrespective of what any economist would do in country X?
Right.
You know, I'm talking about Jordan, for example. We have very similar issues in terms of unemployment, in terms of natural resources, in terms of available jobs. So while I think your proposal would definitely benefit, it still has the question of investors, of the stability in the region, and therefore
Exactly.
lower confidence.
So, I mean, the best example would be probably Lebanon. Lebanon economy right now is based on the tourism sector. And obviously there's no tourism right now in Lebanon. So that just tells us something. We need to look at some other areas to invest our money. We can't just build an economy on a tourism sector because there's nothing you can do to politics and the whole area, the whole macroeconomic environment is always changing. So there's nothing we could do, unfortunately, to encourage investors to come and invest if we're just gonna go from a touristic point of view. It's definitely a touristic place, and I'm giving you the example of Lebanon, and obviously Jordan is the same scenario, probably don't have much experience, but this is when you should start looking at industries where you can create jobs, at least for the low skill and the poor. Like we should invest in agriculture, we should invest in infrastructure. This is an industry that is always gonna create the jobs for the insiders, and at least will rebuild the economy so that we can bring this confidence again, whether it's a confidence in the lira or in the financial market. And this by itself will bring foreigners in the future. So we should move away from this touristic economic formula. Tourism isn't anymore the driver of growth, especially in the area. So we should find other sectors just to help keep the confidence in the banking sector in Lebanon is known to be a good and strong banking sector. But obviously, if we keep doing what we're currently doing, at some point, people are going to just take the money. In fact, most of these foreigners who are coming to Lebanon aren't investing their money in the Lebanese banking sector. They don't trust it anymore. The wealthy people who are leaving Syria are actually investing in Turkey and in other countries. That's just one thing, because, I mean, we've actually ruined this credibility because of these policies that we're doing. So let's just try to think of other industries that at least would help those who are unemployed and low-skilled. Yep.
Thank you for the talk, of course. And I want to mention a comment and a question, first of all, about the refugees in Lebanon, about the Syrian refugees. So you mentioned that the GDP of the country has decreased after the surge of the refugees in Lebanon.
Right, yeah.
Were you talking about the GDP or the GDP per capita?
Well, I'm talking about real GDP.
So if you're talking about real GDP, the thing is, if the spending has increased drastically in Lebanon, how come the GDP has not increased? The spending of, like, as you said, 50% increase in unemployment or...
Yeah. But, let me just point out, I'm not sure if that's actually true. Mm-hmm. Spending never went up.
Okay.
So although we've had people coming in, most of these people coming in Lebanon aren't really stimulating the economy. At the other hand, we've had people pulling their money out. We used to have a lot of money going back from foreigners to Lebanon. Mm-hmm. This was reduced a lot. So the big picture tells us that actually spending have actually declined, not went up, didn't go up.
So my question is, how can we utilize those refugees and to increase the size of the economy, and therefore, because the Syrian problem, the Syrian refugee problem does not seem promising. It's not going to get solved in a year or two. Mm-hmm. So, as you said, 3% decrease in GDP every month. That's a drastic decrease. So
every year, sorry.
Every year.
It's every year.
So, how do you see, like, how can we utilize the work of these refugees to increase the growth of the economy or to increase the economy as a whole?
So, I mean, initially, most of these refugees that we're getting from all over the place were low-skilled. Mm-hmm. So it was tough to accommodate low-skilled workers, because most of our unemployment problem in Lebanon is actually low-skilled unemployment. Now we're having high-skilled people. We're having doctors coming to Lebanon and working, and we're having other people like from the high-skill distribution. So to accommodate them, obviously we need to create jobs. So we need to just pump money into this market. Unfortunately, like last week, the Central Bank of Lebanon have decided that they're not gonna allow investment loans above $5,000. I'm not sure if anybody heard about it, but now you can't get more than $5,000, and I may be wrong about the amount, but it's less than 10,000. So again, this is something that is shocking the economy. It's something that will cut jobs. So we need to just put money there, and this money will create jobs for everyone, for the Lebanese and for the foreigners. And
do you think creating jobs for those low-skilled workers can happen in less than a year or two?
For the
refugees or the low-skilled workers in general?
Well, depending on the policy prescription that you're going to do. I mean, if we decide, and there are talks right now that the lira may be actually depegged at some point. There are talks right now. So if this is something that we will see in the near future, and if the central bank decides to just spend this money that they are sitting on, then hopefully things will change. Otherwise, we're going into terrible. There's the issue of salaries for the public sector workers that is also making a big issue. They're shocking the economy. So if the lira gets depegged and if the central bank pumps some money into the system, then we will obviously see some big changes going on. Obviously, as I mentioned, that investments and the money that should be spent should be actually going to the infrastructure industry. This is where we would see benefits. So if the government or the central bank ended up spending this money on tourism, then nothing is going to change, because nobody is thinking of Lebanon as a touristic place, at least the way they used to think before, just because of the political. So we need to spend at the right place to create jobs.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other questions? Comments? Yes, sir.
Thanks, Rand. You made a lot of that stuff up there a little more understandable, and I appreciate that. Getting back to the United States, maybe about a year or so ago, I don't remember, I was reading or I'd seen on the news where one of the issues that economists were saying is that these big companies and corporations were not hiring people because they were concerned about the economy, the uncertainty of the economy, and they were afraid to spend money. Is that valid? Was that one of the issues? Is that still an issue, or
That's always an issue. It's always an issue that employers, when they're not very confident that the economy has actually improved, and unfortunately, I'll tell you a short story, but basically this is always something to think of. If you have a business and you're not sure how the economy is doing, you don't want to hire someone and then end up shutting down your business. So you want to be careful and wait till you're fully confident that the economy has actually recovered and that you're going to see revenue coming into your firm so that you can hire workers. In fact, with this unemployment figures and the story about the unemployment isn't actually increasing, but it's actually high, is making a lot of employers reconsider now their hiring cycle. So employers, most of them, they look at the news, they look at the numbers, they figure out, okay, unemployment is going down. But with all these now new studies coming out showing that really unemployment isn't going down, the economy isn't as good as it looks, we're spending but nothing is changing, is making a lot of employers be very cautious and changing their thoughts about when they should hire. Nobody want to take the risk and invest in a worker when they're not sure that this worker is going to be productive and will bring in more money than how much you're going to pay him. So that's always part of the equation.
Anybody else?
Yeah, actually, back to the long-term employment issue. I guess I work for a big corporation, and what everyone talks about is it takes a job to get a job, and the longer you don't have a job, obviously, you have to get comfortable with taking a bigger cut in order to take that next job.
Yeah.
So is there any validity to the thesis that part of the reason why people are long-term employees is they're just holding out? They have lifestyles that they have to maintain, kids they have to put through college, and they don't want to take that job because it's not, there's a income disparity that they can't take or can't afford to take.
Well, that's true, but only for a certain period of time. So if you're making 100,000 and you lose your job, you're probably gonna wait. You're not gonna take the first job that comes to you until you at least match your previous job. But depending how long you wait as being unemployed, if you end up staying out of work for 2 years, this is when you start cutting down your expectations. So this is true, but just for the first few months out of work. Now people have actually have written and proposed that let's give employers the option to hire those long-term unemployed at a lower wage than the short ones. I've written an article a few weeks ago for the Washington Post. There was an issue with the minimum wage, and the people were fighting President Obama that you shouldn't increase the minimum wage because if you increase the minimum wage, a lot of jobs will be cut, and so on and so on. One of my proposals is let's just increase the minimum wage for the short-term unemployed. So as an employer, okay, you have the option, let's give the employer the option to hire a long-term unemployed at $7, okay? But if you want to hire a short-term unemployed, you would have to pay the new wage of $10. So this would at least make the long-term unemployed more appealing in monetary terms and may help them bring more long-term unemployed. And it's been, I mean, they like the idea. So obviously some people didn't like it, but most of the economists that were against the increase in the minimum wage like this idea. So this again is along the lines of hiring the long-term unemployed at a lower wage is okay, it's totally fine. It's better than keeping them out of work and letting them at least lose their skills.